My name is Gustav. I'm the CTO and co-founder of a company called Verbling. I didn't see when he did the whole reach of hands. I kind of want to get a better idea because we're going to talk about some tips and tricks, and I kind of want to get a feel for where people are. So, who's like never done anything GraphQL? This is like you're just here to check. Oh, cool. Who's kind of been tipping their toes in a little bit, checking it out, and who's like full-blown GraphQL in production? Wow. So there's a cool mix of people. So I guess I'll keep it somewhere in the middle, and you guys like stop me when you want to hear more, or tell me I'm stupid if I'm being stupid. So Verbling is a language learning platform. We connect language teachers with learners, and it's a video platform, and we build tools and payments around that just to facilitate that sort of transaction. Been around for about 4 years. It's still a very small team, but we're growing fast, we started using GraphQL Write actually when Facebook first released the first version of Relay. Didn't go full-blown sort of production, but we started tipping our toes a little bit, trying it out on some features. Today, about a year and a half later, we're pretty close to 100% migrated away from REST as a main sort of interface. We're about 200 GraphQL types, if you want, which is not huge, but it's not small either. About 250 mutations on those types. And we started off, as I said, at REST like everybody else. And we had this you start a company, you have this grand idea, and it was like, oh, we're going to go for REST. That was the cool thing back then. And you start planning out your interface, and everything seems perfect, everything seems great, and you code it up, and you go to bed feeling really good, and then you wake up, and you have like 10 times more features, you have 10 times more users, and you start getting these requests from like front-end engineers, right? You're saying like, hey, I like this thing you built, like this cool interface, but I really don't want to make like multiple round trips here to get the same data. Can we start like compacting them in and making one custom endpoint, or maybe multiple, or let's just all have custom endpoints all over the place? I feel like you guys know where this lands, right? Like you start with a perfect idea, and you end up somewhere where you have all these aggregated endpoints. You want, you want this little piece of a user, but you also maybe want their, for us, it could be like you want to take the lessons that they've taken, and this becomes really messy, especially in the back end when you try to be really good about caching. You try to be, it gets really messy. So, at least in my head, when I started seeing the cracks of REST, you start thinking about it. What if you have this language that I could give to the front engineers, right? That they can I want these things, give me these things and package them up in a cool way and send them back, right? I feel like we all had those ideas, but nobody had the time and the money or the resources to implement something like that. It was sort of a vision. Facebook has a lot of money, and they're a lot smarter than I am, so they came up with this really cool idea. So we jumped on board right away, and really lucky we did. We're loving it. We don't want to go back, but I want to talk about some of the learnings and some of the things that we learned along the way. So let's make a list. The way I was thinking about doing this, let's first talk sort of grand designs, sort of just bigger picture stuff, and then we go on some really granular stuff. If you guys want to hear more about the big picture stuff or less, you shout out, tell me something. Let's start at the very top. So the way that I think that you go from a REST house, if some of you guys who are still sort of dabbling and try to get convinced to go there, the way that I think you need to go is really to get into a graph sort of mindset. And this might not seem so obvious, but I think that's the first thing that you have to do. You have to start thinking in graphs and not in endpoints. REST is very much about defining an endpoint to do a certain thing. sort of try to scrap that from your head and instead think about how to model your data in graphs. Think about all the both direct database models and abstract models that exist within your application and start thinking about them as a graph. Really, I think the most basic thing to do is get a big sheet of paper and you just start mapping out. It's like, okay, I'm going to start off, take whatever database you have. You just start mapping out all the tables or the models that you have. And then you start doing all the edges between them. How do these connect, right? Once you do this, then take all the abstract things that could happen around them. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But that I always say, you start by mapping that whole space out, and then stop thinking about designing endpoints into this graph. You're saying, like, all my front-end engineers now have this graph. How do I empower the display of the data of this graph? Don't think about, like, how do they get into the graph, how do they query a graph. You just assume that they can query the graph in some way. I mean, there are lots of ways to do it in GraphQL, but that is the mindset. And I think that probably is the biggest thing if you take away from this. Like, try to force yourself into a graph mindset. Hard to explain, but graphs, man. Another thing I would say is approach carefully. GraphQL and the sort of the environment around it is like a crazy Swiss Army knife with all the shit that you want. So I would say approach it with care and really plan out how you're gonna build out your schema. Because I feel like in a lot of ways you can go wrong in many ways. You can build out schemas that are not gonna be performant. They're gonna just represent bad data. They're not gonna scale. It's not gonna. So I would say really take care before you really jump into GraphQL to plan out your schema. So start out with a small test. If you're jumping on board, start taking one thing, map out that one thing. It could be like a user profile. Start thinking about what are these components? How do I represent this in my GraphQL schema, right? Start there. Don't try to do a full-fledged thing on the entire application. Start small. And invest time in really thinking about, we'll talk more about naming, but really think about how this is going to be used now and how it's going to be used for a long time ahead. I think also it's important to still realize that, this came out of Facebook. Facebook has a lot of resources, and they have a lot of tools built around GraphQL that we necessarily, as a community, don't really have access to. There's a lot of great stuff coming out of places like this. But if your application or your company has specific domains where there isn't really a way, set in stone way to do authentication in GraphQL. Security isn't completely mapped out. Like DDoSing, for example, or monitoring. These are things that are not they haven't been around for 15, 20 years. We don't really yet know what the best practice is here. So if those are things that are super important to your company, you should think carefully about it. When you map out, I touched a little bit on this, but when you map out your schema, don't only take your databases, several databases, and map them out. Also think about abstract components of the application. And I think this is really where GraphQL becomes really powerful. One thing we do is we actually map some third-party APIs that we use to call on the front end, and we just wrap them in a GraphQL schema. That's a little cool thing. But there are more abstract models in your application that are not necessarily core data models that could be really nice and useful. I think Lee Byron, he brought up, for example, search is a really important thing in GraphQL conference. You can create really powerful models where they are sort of backed, search, for example. You search, and the search result might be your data models, but you can wrap that in a lot of metadata, suggested search, or closer search. So you can really dig deep down and represent more abstract relationship between models. We have a cool thing, for example, we have In our backend, we have a model for a student. We have a model for a teacher. Right? We don't have a direct model for a relationship between a student and a teacher. But that's something that you can easily define in GraphQL. So start also thinking about like what are the relationships between the edges of these different data bus models. So yeah, a takeaway I guess is don't just stamp your database and that's your GraphQL. Think more. More actually asset metadata and search results are some ideas. One really important thing, and this was also brought up at the GraphQL conference, which is great, design for the future. GraphQL is a versionless API, so you really want to think hard about it. Naming is hard, we know that. It's even more true in GraphQL, I feel like, because of the versionless of it. Can a new engineer that comes on board, can he just open up graphical or something? Can he understand the entire schema? Are you leaking implementation details, for example? Is the naming and your schema, is it supporting version 2, version 3 of your feature or your app? Does it also support new environments, regions, devices, right? Think about these things carefully, because if you don't, you're just going to end up extending the schema into eternity, right? And we don't want that. Another thing that I think is important, don't forget about your fundamentals that you learn in computer science school or whatever you went. Modularize your graphs. We don't want to end up with these enormous objects that contain all the data you want for application, right? Modularize. Think about like how do these different aspects of my application, how do they tie in together, and how can I be smart? How can I be a good computer scientist or a good coder, and how do I modularize this? Don't forget about your core like sort of object-oriented concepts when you're designing your schemas. Still think about it. Single responsibility principle, like one model should probably represent one thing. If it's representing 5 things, you should probably rethink it. Hide implementation details, pretty obvious, but can be, it happens to the best of us. Don't carry state to the graph. This is sort of I guess a lower level thing, but as you're querying the graph, you don't want to be carrying data through your edges to rely on the resolvers. I don't know if that makes sense. So if I start here at some node and I pick up data on the way of my path, I don't want to rely on the fact that I enter the graph at this place to query to resolve the data model over here. Each model should be resolvable, hopefully by itself, with little to no other data. Does that make sense? Okay. That was a little abstract, but I have seen it, and it does happen if you don't think about it. Self-document, I mean, one of the most powerful things of OpenGraph, I think, is the self-documentation. But it doesn't really happen by itself. You have to be diligent about it as a team. Always fill out field and object descriptions. Seems pretty obvious, but I actually ended up writing a test that makes sure it's like if you're committing something, you better have a description on the field or the object. These things are important things to start off early, so that you get the sort of the super powerful self-documentation aspect of OpenGraph. Use the power of enums. Don't use floating strings that are they could be an arbitrary thing. If you're bringing on a new engineer and he sees this cool, cool objects, like, what can this field be? Like, show me. Actually, show me the values. So don't forget the power of enum. It's easy to just slap a string in there and be cool with it, but use enums. Naming, again, like, think hard about it. People are going to read this maybe when you're gone, 10 years from now, if the product's still around. So think hard about it. Okay, so that was kind of my high-level stuff. Now I'm going to just go on some really, detailed stuff. that we've found some use in. Polymorphism. There might be some controversy here. Open GraphQL, like my opinion, is don't do it. If you disagree, we can go have a fight outside or something, but there's some support. There are unions, there's some basic support for some polymorphism. My honest opinion is you don't. It's the same way that some polymorphism probably isn't very well suited for your actual database backend. Don't do that in GraphQL. Your resolvers are going to be much harder to do if an object is represented by potentially an n number of other resolvers. You're gonna have a harder time caching that resolver. It's gonna be harder to argue where the data came from. It's gonna be harder to test. I mean, here's a simple thing that we do. A user can also be a teacher, can also be an admin. We just represent them as direct objects. And they might be represented as the same sort of same object in the back end, but it's just much easier to argue about the data this way. But I would love to hear, if you guys don't agree, just tell me, fuck off. While you're designing your schemas, use the opportunity to dry up your client-side code. So here's some examples. So here's some long thing where I'm checking if this user that is queried is actually the same user that I'm logged in as. This is a common thing. I'm looking at my own profile. For example, this code can show up everywhere. Just take the opportunity to extend your user schema with some contextual information based on who I'm authenticated as. I can just do user.isme. It's not always like, sometimes you just stamp your user model and you're like, oh, that was it. Well, think about some of the cooler things that you can actually help out your front-end engineers do. Here's another thing, is admin. Instead of doing some pulling down all the roles to the front end and doing an include or something, you can just do a simple thing like this, has role. Authenticated querying. This might make sense for some of you guys have done GraphQL for a long time, but it might not be obvious that when you're visiting a node as an authenticated user, you can do some really cool things. So here I'm visiting a teacher fragment from an authenticated user, and I can actually get my lessons. That's a pretty cool thing. I'm moving into the graph with an authenticated context. And it really empowers, you can do really, really cool things. So don't forget about that you have that information. I have the information, I am logged in as this person. What is my relation to this data or this object that I just looked at? There's more my progress we have on the lesson. I'm following instead of querying some long thing of followers or something. I can just ask, am I following this teacher with me as logged in? It's really powerful. So start thinking about that too. It's okay, I'm looking at this model. What can I gather from it that I don't have to offload on the client? Okay, here's another pretty powerful concept that when you are coming into an object or a node in your graph, it's sometimes pretty useful. It at least makes your code pretty clear if you know who your parent is. So here's who the edge that you got there into. So here's a pretty straightforward example. I'm getting into this lesson connection. So I want to see this is just some lesson query. And if I'm coming from a teacher, I actually want to see the lessons from someone who taught lessons. And if I'm coming from a user, I want to know the lessons that user took. Does that make sense? It's easy to forget this, and your code is going to just become a lot simpler if you're able to argue about the edge that you came there with. So don't forget that you have that information as you're querying it. This is sort of the last thing. There's a lot of discussion and sort of ideas on how to authenticate best in GraphQL. I don't know if the community as a whole has landed on what is best. You could like hide the entire schema behind another endpoint or something. You could split up objects so that like certain models are authenticated. What we've done that we think is pretty useful is being able to, on a field-by-field basis, argue if the authenticated user should have access or not. Here's an example. We created this simple middleware that there's a gist for it, where I can say if I am an admin or if I am myself, allow the resolver to continue on email. We found field-by-field authentication to be a lot simpler than any alternatives. Also interested to hear what you guys think, but it's a lot easier than having to block entire edge traversals, for example. If you cut it off, because it just gets really hard. You have to deal with a lot of nulls and a lot of throwing of errors. And so we don't do that. We just say, you're not, as this person, allowed to enter this field. So yeah, that's pretty much it. Verbling is always looking for people. We're growing really fast. We're doing exciting GraphQL stuff. So yeah, open up for some questions or throw a tomato or something.
Thanks, Gustav.
Yeah.
Do you have any questions? Over there.
So going through kind of your lessons learned, did you give much thought to kind of the performance perspective of, okay, you want to create these more simple types and have more type explosion versus generic types? Mm-hmm. How does that have a perfect impact for going and loading all this data?
So the question is, more complex object versus simple, or use more objects?
Right, and so when building a graph of data,
Mm-hmm.
If you're not getting all this data at one time, you could easily get into like a n-squared scenario where you've got to keep going back to the source of truth and getting more and more data.
Yeah, so we use a data loader from Facebook and also some other caching. So there's certainly, you can certainly make circular sort of traversals that will have some performance impact. I'm pretty sure you can DDoS our site right now if you go, try. It's something that we're working on, but our caching layer is working pretty well. So if your graph if your traversal ends up ever querying the same ID of the same object, that resolver is ever done once per sort of call.
Have you got a point where you can do just a batch request to get everything at one time, or are you still? Per project, per ID, we do one, but we don't batch up. No, we don't do that.
More questions?
Hi. Thanks for the presentation, by the way. So if you do field-by-field authentication, how do you handle, if you're not authenticated, do you return null?
Yeah.
So your front end, you have to check for every field if it's authenticated or not. So you have to check all the nullability, right?
Yeah, I mean, this is an early, I remember having some discussions with the Facebook guys, and I think this was kind of a design pattern that the GraphQL community kind of was forced into because of decisions made by Facebook. And that's you should be able to deal with nulls. You should be able to deal with most of your fields being null at some point. So that's kind of, I guess we've kind of embraced it. We're kind of okay with dealing with nulls because there's a lot of other things around GraphQL that kind of demands you to deal with them. So yeah.
All right, thank you.
Yeah.
Hey, A little bit more high-level question. Initially, you started out by saying REST is convoluted in a sense, especially as you develop it over a longer term. But then you went into a rant about planning for the future. Sorry, the rant word, but think about the model, domain-driven design, object-oriented, encapsulation, and so on and so on. And I think this is great, but here's the question. Would you still consider using REST for certain parts of the application stack where it makes sense? Because I always believe, single technology is never the solution. You should apply a tool where it's needed best.
Right. Yeah, sure. I mean, I think where the power of GraphQL comes in consideration with the client. I mean, it's a query language for the client. So certainly REST for backend services or, for other, yeah, certainly. Yeah, it's not a, but I'd say we wouldn't go back to REST for any sort of client-side code, probably.
All right, we have time for one more question.
Hey, so you said you used Relay from early on.
Yeah.
How has that been?
It's been good. Mutations,
Yeah.
I hear a lot of complaints, and I agree. The interface is not completely straightforward. I've heard rumbles about it changing, about their new things coming out. I'm looking forward to that. Yeah, other than the rights, it's been pretty good. I mean, it was rocky in the beginning. It was immature when we first landed it. But yeah, my biggest gripe is probably mutations, and then I was hoping that sort of an idea behind subscriptions would have gone faster. I mean, there doesn't seem to be super clear consensus, at least outside of Facebook, how to do it. We've been trying to, we're experimenting with it. But yeah, other than that, it's been good.
All right, let's give Gustav another round of applause.